I read the Bible in Spanish. I've read the Bible in Spanish all my life, and this is old Spanish. This is not modern Spanish, and this is extremely old Spanish. It's older in King James, and that's what this is. It's about 50 years older. It was done about 50 years before the King James in exile. And so the Bible most Spanish language Protestants use is revision, the one that I have here. Okay. My name is Dr. Juan Martínez. I'm a professor here at Fuller Seminary. I teach in the areas of pastoral leadership and Hispanic studies, and I'm also a church historian. As I think about 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I want to be looking at them as a historian. When I approach 1st and 2nd Chronicles, I remember that history is always interpretation, that we write, that we tell history to try to interpret our present. In other words, we seek to understand the present in light of key elements of the past. So history is always about a historian, a person, a group of people trying to say, how do we understand where we are today in light of where we came from? And so the chroniclers are trying to help the Jewish people understand what happened. How did we end up in exile? How did we end up in a situation where instead of having Jerusalem and the temple as kind of the center of our reality, the majority of Jews will never return to Jerusalem, other than maybe as a one-time visit, as a pilgrimage? How is God a part of all of this? And how do we understand the sin, the brokenness, the reality that God is here? This story is being told from the perspective of a people that are looking to God and believing that God is at work. And so they're seeing a grand narrative that doesn't end with the falling of Jerusalem, with the possible rebuilding of the temple. And so that reminds me of the quote of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was then quoting the 19th century U.S. Clergyman Theodore Parker. Evil may so shape events that Caesar will occupy a palace and Christ a cross. But that same Christ will rise up and split history into AD and BC, so that even the life of Caesar must be dated by his name. Yes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I think that quote helps me understand what the chroniclers are trying to tell us. So how do I read it? How would I invite you to read the Chronicles? Well, something very practical. Read it in the order that it's in the Bible. Why? Because as you read through the first part of the historical books of the Old Testament, it sets the framework of which the chroniclers are going to reinterpret. They're going to say, look at all this history. Think about all of this. How do we understand it now that we're in exile? And that's an important perspective. That's an important thing. So we have this grand story that God has given us through the writers of Scripture. And now we have a chance to look at it again through the Chronicles. And so I invite you to read these books in prayer, to be attentive to your own history. How has God shaped you as you read these books? And then being attentive, if this is how God worked in the past, how is God working today? And reading toward God's hope, God's future. Can we believe in God's future in light of the fact that God has been at work with his people, not because they've been perfect, not because there hasn't been punishment for sin, not because things beyond their control haven't changed the way they wanted things to be and the way they thought God was working, but because God is still in charge and that we are moving toward God's future. So I want to bless you and invite you into the reading of 1st and 2nd Chronicles.